Okay, so we're going to do session 3.2 today, and this is an overview. We're going to talk about page layout grids. So this is a pretty cool tutorial. We're going to, let's see, I meant to, right here. We'll introduce you to the grid layouts, overview of grid-based layouts, fixed versus and fluid grids, and CSS frameworks. We'll set up a grid, we'll design the grid rows, design the grid columns, and we'll add some page content. And then we'll do some outlining, outlining a grid, and introduce the CSS grid, grids, defining a CSS grid, and assigning content to grid cells. Alright, so we're going to start right here, the visual overview. And you can see right here it says div class equals col, and then it's got these two numbers. The col 2-3 class indicates a column that is 2/3 of the width of its row. The column 1-2 class indicates that the column is half the width of its row. In a grid layout, rows and columns are marked using the div element. Okay, so you're assigning a div. The pseudo content is added after a grid row to keep it from collapsing around the columns. And remember, we just have talked about container collapse. All grid columns are floated within their rows. The class name, let me move over here since that's what we're talking about. So it says col float left. The class name provides a hint as to the width of the grid columns. Okay, so it says col 1, 2, 1/2, 50%, 1/3, 33%, 2/3, 66%. And remember again that percent, which means flexible, right? Not fixed. And then we're going to do the outline property that draws a line around selected grid. So let's go into this a little bit more. Alright, grids are a classic layout technique that has been used in publishing for hundreds of years, and like many other publishing techniques can be applied to web design. The basic approach is to imagine that the page is comprised of a system of intersecting rows and columns that form a grid. The rows are based on page content. A long page with several articles might span several rows, or it could be a home page with introductory content that fits within the single row. The number of columns is based on the number that provides the most flexibility in laying out the page content. Many grid systems are based on 12 columns because 12 is evenly divisible by 2, 3, 4, and 6. But other sizes are also used. So we've got 12 columns here, right? And the space in between are the rows. So you can have a row that's half the size of the page, right? Okay. So the page designer then arranges the page elements to fit real pretty inside of the grid, okay? So right there, that would be 100%, okay? 12 of the 12 columns. This one has 1, 2, okay? This one down here, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then these up here individually have 2. So you can do lots of stuff with the grid layout. It says it should be stressed that the grid is not part of the web page content. Instead, it's a systematic approach to visualizing how to best fit content into the page. Working from grid has several aesthetic and practical advantages, including grids add order to the presentation of the page content, adding visual rhythm, which is pleasing to the eye. A consistent, logical design gives readers the confidence to find the information they seek. New content can be easily placed within a grid in a way that it is consistent with previously entered information. A well-designed grid is more easily accessible for users with disabilities and special needs. And grids speed the development of the process by establishing a systematic framework for the page layout. There are two types of grid layouts, flex grids and fluid grids. In a flex grid layout, every column has a fixed position. Widths of the columns and margins are specified. And fluid grids provides more support across different devices with different screen sizes. Column width is expressed in percentages, okay, still the same thing. And a lot of times, let's see what RCCs looks like. So we can, if we make this smaller, you see how it stacks up? And then when it's big, see how they go side by side? Okay. So that's the difference between a fixed and the fluid. CSS frameworks. Let's see. There we go. A framework is a software package that provides a library of tools to design a website. Includes style sheets for grid layouts and built-in scripts to provide support for a variety of browsers and devices. Some of the most popular CSS frameworks include Bootstrap, YAML 4, 960 Grid System, and Foundation 3, HTML Boilerplate, and Skeleton. A grid layout is based on rows of floating elements. Each floating element constitutes a column. The set of elements floating side by side establishes a row. Many grid layouts use the div or division element to mark distinct rows and columns of the grid. And that's from the visual display that we seen earlier. Right here, okay? This is an example of a simple grid consisting of a single row and two columns. Okay, right here we've got one row, the div is the row, and our columns are within it. The page content is placed within the div element. So the content would be displaced in between these div elements right here. Okay. It's common in grid layouts to give the column class names indicating their width. So we talked about that earlier, looking at the overview, the image overview, the 1/4 and the 1/2 and the 2/3 and the 1/3. That shows you right here, okay? 1/4, 1/4. This is 50%. This one is 67% and 33%. So this is the proposed grid layout for the chocolates. Alright, so we're going to use our text editor and we're going to open PC About Text HTML. So let's see. here we go. HTML. Name and date, as always. Okay. And has already added the same header used for the chocolate home page to this page. Okay, so this is the header. Let's open it up and see what it looks like. File and save as without the TXT. So we should have a PC about HTML. This is what we've got right here, and she's already added this header. Okay, there's our image, and these are our style sheet isn't connected yet. Alright, so they're going to have us do that. We're going to add in our rows and columns. We're going to start with this first column here. Div class equals row. And mine already automatically puts the div tag up. Now it gets really confusing here because we have open div tags. So let's see what we've got. Let's read through it before we start trying to type it up. We've got div class row equals row. Okay, that div ends here. All right, so that's our last div, our beginning and our last. So this should be our last one down here. Okay, we're gonna go over a little bit so we can see that we're getting another div, and its ending is up here. Okay. Yep. So its ending is above this. And this one's 2/3. Okay. And then we've got some rows to put in there. So let's go down one more just to space it out so we can keep up with what we're doing. So div, let's see where we're at. Class equals row. Now its ending is here, okay, because we've got these two columns inside of it. Alright, so now let's put our two columns inside of this one. Div class equals call -1-2. That one can stay there, and we're just going to copy and paste the same thing, okay? Because we're going to have two 1/2 columns of this 2/3. So we're going to go up under the row, and we're going to make another row. So we're going to make sure we have it lined up so we don't get confused. Right now we still see that this one ends our very first column and this one ends our row. Okay, our very first or our second row. Alright, so let's add. Worked out well this time after I read through it a few times. Now remember, we've got two columns to put in here. we can just copy and paste these. Try to keep your indents together, because if you do, the lines help you figure it out, okay? So now we're here. We've got an indent div here, okay? That's that right here. That's that column. It wants us to add another column after that. So we're going to go under it. We're going to go div class equals. I wish I could hit the right button. Call, and it's going to be 1/3. Whoop. Div class call 1/3, and it has an indent. Alright. And then we have an indent, and then it wants us to do a third row under this div. Because remember, this is our first row. This is our first row. This is our second row. Now we're going to do a third row. So go type enter under that. Div class equals row. Alright. It took a minute. Now it can get confusing, and what makes it confusing is because we're nesting. We're nesting these columns and rows into this one. Now obviously this one wasn't, and that one wasn't as confusing as this one because we weren't doing any nesting, right? Okay, so let's move on. Save your changes to the file, but don't close it. Now that we've established the grid for the page content, you'll need to set up the styles for the grid, starting with the grid row. Grid rows contain floating columns. Since a grid row starts a new line within the page, it should only be displayed when both margins are clear of the previously floated columns. Since it contains its own set of floating columns, it has to be able to expand in height to cover those objects, or else the floating columns run the risk of bleeding into the next row. As with the page footer from the last section, you can establish these rules for grid rows using the following style rule. Div row after, clear both, content empty, display table. Add this style rule to a new style sheet called PC Grid CSS. So that's, we've got one right here. It says use your editor to open your PC Grids TXT. Okay, we're going to file, save as, take that TXT out. Alright. Now we're going to, within the grid row style selection right here, div.row, clear both. Okay. Add the following style rule to ensure that the grid row expands to cover all of the floating elements. To stop container collapse. Div.row after, clear both, content, display table. Alright, styles for row div elements. That one displays the row only when both margins are clear of the previously floated columns. Automatically expands the row to cover floating columns. That's what we just done. Next, you'll create style rules for the grid columns. Okay. Every grid column needs to be floated within its row. In the grid you set up for the chocolates page, the grid columns are placed within the div element having the general class name. So it says call, numerator, denominator. So you know that we did one with, what did we do? We did, it was in our PC about HTML. Sorry, it took me. So we did call 2, 3. That's what it means by numerator denominator, 2/3. Okay. So we're gonna within the grid column style. So I need to get us back to our PC grid CSS. Grid column styles right here. We're using the rule it told us about up here that I didn't explain. To float all grid columns, you can use the following attribute selector, which matches all div elements. Okay, so this is the code. Let me go ahead and paste it in there so you can maybe see it a little better. It's telling any class that equals call dash needs to float left. That's all it's saying. Okay, so you put them in brackets right there, and it's just like anything else, except you have your caret character there that says any class that equals call dash float left. Okay, inside a div. Don't want to leave that part out. Alright, so we just did that. It matches all div elements whose class attribute starts with call, floats every column on the left. Save your changes. Finally, you have to establish the width of each column based on its class name. For example, div elements with the class name of call 1/3 will use the following style rule to set the width up to 1/3 or 33.33% of the width of the parent element. And what's the parent element? It's the grid row, right? Okay. So let's add these style rules. Within the grid column style section, add the following style rules. And it's telling us down here that we can continue on with that. We can use 1/16. That would be, you know, and then we could have 1/12. And that would have a width of 8.33. So it's all just a bit of math. We're going to add the page content. So it wants us to return make sure we save this page and return to that. Directly after the div class row, you're going to type in about Pandasia chocolates. That's the very first row we did. Let's save it. See what we've got so far. It's just right here right now. They haven't told us to add anything to it yet. I'm just double checking. So remember we've got to have our CSS files linked up here. Okay. But it didn't ask us to yet, so let's not get ahead of ourselves. Next, you'll insert the text for the left column of the second row. Open PC text file. PC text file. There it is, all the way at the bottom. And it says for the all the way from that H2 to that ending paragraph about the company. Okay, and it's going to go in our first column. It wants to go right up under that 2/3. So we'll go ahead and hit enter, and we'll hit that, put that right there. So it says div class row, div class call 2/3, our company. Okay. Within the left column are 2 nested rows. So these are our 2 nested rows. They have 2 columns apiece. Alright, it wants us in one of them put about chocolate and then enjoying chocolate. So we got to put about chocolate in the first one. Right here goes your H2. Okay, and then here, enter, and it wants us, no, did I do that right? I did not do that right. And the first 1/2, it says H3, enjoying chocolate. And then come up right up under there and get your enjoying chocolate text right there. Okay. Now we have another column right here. Okay, everything's looking right. So next is healthy chocolate. I'll grab that text. So the healthy chocolate goes under our second 1/2 one, this one right here. So I would like to hit enter in between it and throw that up, and that still shows that that div is there. Okay, and that div is there. Next we have single origin and blends. And that goes in that second one right here. And like I said, I like to hit enter so I can put it in between, and it's still showing that that one is there. You see how they're kind of highlighting too? Alright, I'm going to do the same thing here. And it's ethical produce. There we go. Now, we're working in the call 1/3, and it wants us to do the facts. And it has aside tags right there, so that should be in our text, and it is. So grab from aside, and remember these lists. It's a list right there. Copy that. And paste that there. Okay. Go to the last grid row that we've done down here and insert the following HTML code between the opening and closing div tags. So we're putting our footer there. Okay. Now we're going to link our style sheet. So I want you to save this, and I want you to take a little peek. So we're going to go back and we're going to refresh it. And you see there's nothing to it, right? It's all just stacking up. just like normal blocks. They're all blocks. So when we link these style sheets, remember where they go. They go in the head right up under the title. We'll get some formatting going on. So you should be putting in your reset style sheet, your grid style sheet, and it says use styles to CSS style. Link here. And we made this one and we made this one. This one was already done for us. It has the typography and stuff. So let's file, save, go back, bam. Look at that little bit of code. Do I have the about right? Let's see. Not there. I don't think I forgot my H1. I did. So make sure you have your H1 in. Let's see what it looks like now. Oh, that's a little bit better, isn't it? So then we have our company. Okay, it's got the pictures in there. And that's 2/3 of the page, right? And then we've got these nested in there as well. 1, 2, 1, 2. So that we had 4. And then there's our footer. And that's how it should look. Read that. I'm not going to read it to you. Really interesting. If you go to any web template, the content's going to be that. And I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. Alright, so we're going to outline a grid. Outlines are simply lines drawn around an element and closing it. We worked with that. It's just like tables, a table border, except it's an outline. Okay, so the width of the line used to outline is defined as outline width property, your outline color, outline style. The style can be double, dotted, dashed, grooved, inset, ridge, or outset. This should be kind of familiar from when we worked on the tables. Okay, you can put all of those together with width, style, and color. One pix dotted green. Okay, instead of doing all of the different outline width, you can do outline, and as long as you put it in that order, you can get by with one line of code. So we're going to add our outline. PC Grid CSS. Here, if we scroll, it's going to be, we're going to make sure we make us a couple of new lines. So it says, did y'all see that I put that all up in our own place? So I am going to cut. I apologize. I haven't felt that great today. I think I might have a tiny tummy bug. Alright. Copy. And so that's your outline style. So we're going to save that. So it should look like this, okay? Let's bring it up. Because that kind of all runs together. I don't know if I like the red, but it's for emphasis, right? Alright, so what's that down there? There's a whole nother column right there. Is that what it's supposed to look like? Yep. Alright. This shows you how to create drop caps with CSS. You can do all sorts of cool stuff with CSS, you guys. Make it look real pretty. So take a look at, read into the insights. So we just designed our first grid. We're going to define a CSS grid. They're a fast, flexible way of creating a layout, but they are not without their problems. The most obvious problem is that setting up the grid increases the size and the complexity of the HTML code, right, by adding another level of markup language. But another equally serious problem is that grids undermine the fundamental rule that the HTML should consist solely of informational content, while all instructions regarding presentation should be included in the style sheet. However, under the HTML grid system, the div elements have no purpose other than defining how the page should be rendered. And if the designer wants to change the layout, the HTML file and the style sheet will both have to be modified, adding another layer of complexity to the site design. In comes defining the CSS grid. Since grids are an important and useful tool, the W3C is working toward adding grid styles to CSS to create a grid display without the use of div elements. CSS is now adding the following grid-based properties. So you'll have a selector, display grid, grid template rows, and grid template columns. The grid keyword for the display property establishes that the selected element will be displayed as a grid. The number of rows and columns in the grid are set by the grid template rows and the grid template columns properties, where track list is spaced separate heights or column widths. Okay. For example, this following style rule establishes a grid for the section element. The grid consists of 3 rows, okay, with the height of the first and last rows set to 100 pixels, okay. Grid template rows, the first and last rows are set to 100, and the middle one is set to auto. The 3 columns, one set to 25%, one set to 50%, and another set to 25%. FR unit represents the fraction of available space left on the grid after all other rows or columns have attained their maximum allowable size. For example, the following style creates 4 columns with the dimensions specified in the style rule. Grid template 200, 250, 1 FR and 2 FR. The FR unit can be thought of as a share of the available space, so that in this example, after 450 pixels have been given, right there, right, to the first 2 columns, whatever space remains is divided between the last 2 columns with the RF, or 1/3 allotted to the 3rd column, and the 2 FR, or 2/3 of the 4th column. So right there, there's 4 columns. We're going to assigning content to grid cells. Elements in a CSS grid are placed within a grid cell at the intersection of the specified row and column. By default, all the specified elements are placed in the grid cell located at the intersection of the first row and the first column. To place an element in a different cell, you must use the grid row start with an integer showing defines the starting and ending row or column that contains the content. For example, the following style rule places the aside element to cover the 2nd and 3rd rows and the 1st and 2nd columns. Okay, grid row start the second and third row. Start on the second row, end on the third row at the first and second columns. These coordinates can also be written into a more compact form, okay, like that right there. If you specify a single number, the content is placed within a single grid cell. The following style rule places the assigned element in the second row and the first column on the grid. There was 3-2, you guys. Read back through it. Make sure that you read. I definitely would recommend reading what I skipped over. Just the reference, defining grids with CSS, because it's a little confusing. Okay, and make sure that you read that Pro Skills that we've seen too. Alright, I'm going to get this video ready for you, and then I'll start on 3-3.